Hello and welcome to the Critical Hold Training Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about neutral spine. It comes from an article that I've been sent. I get sent many articles because I say certain things and then people comment and say, you've got to read this because this will change your mind. This will show you the light. But this article that I had been sent by this commenter, I'd already read. I'd already had an understanding of and sort of is able to see some of the context and the nuance in which some of the things that are being said. So what we're going to do is we're not going to go through the whole article, but I've just pulled out some of the parts of it. So we'll look at 5 different parts. We'll look at 5 different quotes from it, and then we'll discuss some of the context and the nuance and try and understand where the article's coming from it. In part 1, the quote that we're going to be talking about is, however, biomechanical evidence comparing lifting strategies associated with varying lumbar postures does not support the use of a single technique over another when lifting loads during occupational tasks. Evidence to support the adoption of the neutral spine during lifting, therefore, clearly requires review in the context of S&C coaches practice. So that's the quote. Now, what seems a bit odd to me is that they're comparing occupational tasks and lifting to strength and conditioning coaching practices, where the lifting is completely different. The size of the object, the weight of the object potentially, the position of the object, because S&C coaching practices are very controlled. You're able to control the reps, you're able to control the weight, you're able to control recovery time between reps and sets, you're able to control how many exercises you do, and therefore how many reps that you do as well. So it seems a bit odd that they're using the fact that in occupational studies and occupational tasks, people are using varying lifting postures. I think I looked at the reference for this, and it was the stoop squat, the one with the straight back, and the squat. So like an RDL type position where you hip hinge, a squat style where you squat down and keep your back upright, and then a stoop where you have your legs straight and you just bend straight over with a bent back. I think that's the 3, if I'm not mistaken. So the first point is a bit odd that they're comparing the two when there are so many different or so many different nuances that come with occupational tasks, the nuances with S&C coaching, and the fact that they don't really match. Also, another sort of caveat to it is also the population. So the people that are actually doing the lift. So if you think about occupational tasks, that's like an average Joe. That's anyone that works and has a manual job that requires you to lift. Whereas strength and conditioning environments are generally very fit individuals. They've been, they're conditioned from doing it for a prolonged period of time as a general rule. And so you can sort of start to see that there are some inconsistencies, I guess, is a way of describing it, in that quote. For the very simple fact they're comparing an occupational environment to a S&C environment. Because as I've mentioned, like the object could be very awkward. It could be an awkward box to lift in an awkward position that requires a certain position. Now obviously a study is going to be more controlled than that, and I think another reference further in the study, I don't think I cover this in these 5 parts, but it was about a 5 kilo weight as well. So again, you can't really compare an occupational task that requires you to lift a 5 kilo weight to an S&C environment where you could be lifting 50 kilos, 100 kilos, in some environments 200 kilos, whatever it may be. You can't really compare the two. So I'm sort of going around in a little bit of a circle here, but when I read it for the first time, it just seemed a bit odd that when they're talking about using a neutral spine and the efficacy and the safety of a neutral spine is being compared across occupation and S&C environments. So it just seems a bit odd. So that's kind of like the first one, and there, as we work through, there are other examples of this where it's just a bit, I just don't quite understand how they've joined those dots and things like that. So if I was talking about a neutral spine, I would want a neutral spine being used in an S&C environment should inform the S&C environment, because they are two completely different things, and there is the occupational environment will be a different mechanism of injury, and I think we'll cover one of these in the parts, is a different injury mechanism than an S&C environment, not only because of the object being lifted, but also the person doing the lifting. So they will have certain physical attributes that will be you'll be able to lift rather than the occupational individual, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the first one, where it is sort of loosely talking about neutral spine, but it's more to do with the inconsistency in the fact that they're talking about occupational environment and joining it to the strength and conditioning environment and saying the occupational environment should inform the S&C environment, which, I mean, loosely and broadly maybe, but you would want to see S&C involving or informing S&C. In part 2, we're talking about the forces on the spine and the use of neutral spine and the use of non-neutral spine, if you will. So the quote is, "When the forces experienced by the spine are high, such as they are during lifting, deviations into the elastic zone cause strain on the passive structures that has the potential to cause tissue damage. However, when the spine is in a neutral position, the stress placed on the passive structures is minimized, and the spinal muscles are predominantly responsible for controlling spinal alignment." So we've got the neutral posture. So as they're saying here, stress placed on the passive structures is minimized. And by the passive structures, they mean the vertebra, the ligaments, and the disc, because they are passive. The active structures are the muscles and the tendons, because they are acting on that area. Now, when we deviate from that, because neutral spine is a zone, there is flexibility to it, if you will. The passive structures that has the potential to cause tissue damage. So as we move from that, in some respects, we create tissue damage. So we have to sort of come to it from that understanding. Now, what comes with that is the individual doing the lifting. Because I have a certain capacity to lift, so I can lift a certain weight. I then have a tolerance to that weight and how much I can do it. Then if we go back to part number 1, where we had an occupational individual who is just doing lifting, they don't do exercise, they just live a normal life, let's say, they're going to have a certain capacity for lifting, and they're going to have a certain tolerance to the load as well. So their potential for lifting may not be as much as mine. If we then go beyond me and we go to a more sort of professional weight lifter type person, they're going to have a greater capacity to lift more than me and the other person, and they may have a greater tolerance for load. Now, when the occupational person goes out of neutral, they may have a greater potential for tissue damage. So if we all lift, let's just say all three of us, all those three people that I've talked about, we are all lifting 20 kilos. So the occupational person may be able to do that, but may not be able to do it much with a bent spine. I, however, may be able to do it for most of the day, because that's what I do anyway. I'm lifting weights up around, 4 to 5 hours a day. So I have a greater capacity to be able to do that. And then you've got the professional weightlifter who can lift a 200 kilo deadlift. So if they pick up a 20 kilo, it pretty much does nothing. So with regards to tissue damage, they're going to get very little tissue damage from a 20 kilo weight, whereas the individual that doesn't exercise and just lifts up boxes and works in a warehouse, they may well have a much less capacity to lift 20 kilos. What we then have is the repetition of that. How much do they need to do it? A professional weightlifter may be able to tolerate 20 kilos, but if they were asked to do it 1,000 times a day, then it may be a problem. Whereas the occupational individual, they may only be able to do it 50 times in a day or 10 times in a day. Whereas me in the middle might be somewhere in the middle. So we've got to try and bring that understanding to when we're talking about forces on the spine and the use of neutral spine when lifting in a gym or in everyday life. Because a lot of people will question me and say, lifting with a bent spine is fine. Okay, let's explore that. Who's the person doing it? How much have they got to do it? What weight are they lifting? What's their capacity for that? What's their tolerances to fatigue and how much they can do that? Because if it's the pro weightlifter, crack on. Go and lift that 20 kilo weight as much as you like. But with the occupational person, it may be completely different. So when we're talking about neutral spine, we have to put it in that context of who is the individual, what are they doing, when are they doing it, how much are they lifting, how awkward is it, what position have they got to be in or could they be in, so on and so forth. As I mentioned in the last part, in a gym environment, it's completely different. We can control that. If someone says, that's too heavy for me, we can lighten that load. But if the occupational person says, these boxes are too heavy for me, they may not say anything and just get on with the job in hand. If they've got to move 50 boxes from location A to location B in 30 minutes, it's like, right, I've got to get this job done. And that's what they do. They haven't got time to ask someone else to help them if they've got an awkward one at the back or whatever. So we have to understand, and when we're looking at the science, we have to understand what is that scientific study talking about? What is the context it's being used in? And can I take that context out and place it in what I'm trying to describe? So in part 2, we know that forces on the spine are different when it's in neutral and when it's not in neutral. And that's something that needs to be understood. We can't just blindly say that neutral spine is good and a bent spine is bad. Or a bent spine is good and neutral spine is pointless. It's not that simple. There is more information to it, and I hope I've covered a bit of that in the last 5 or 6 minutes. Part 3 is a bit of an extension from part 2. The quotes aren't necessarily linked because they're not necessarily from the same part of the study, but how we'll discuss it, we'll kind of try and sort of link the two. We'll talk a little bit more about consistency again. So the quote is, although maintaining a neutral spine is consistently included in technical models for lifting exercises performed in the weight room, evidence that suggests that the spine flexes beyond the neutral zone during the performance of strength training exercises. So the sort of the link is, in the previous part we talked about when we come out of neutral, there's more potential for tissue damage. When we're in neutral, that same load or force is sort of spread around the tissues, so it's minimized on the passive structures. What they're now saying here is that although people are told to maintain a neutral spine, they don't, essentially. Now, the key thing here is, because I think what they're trying to insinuate is that, and I'm not 100% sure of this because it's not 100% clear in the study, but I think they're trying to insinuate that even when people go into a lift, their spine comes out of the neutral zone, and I think what they're trying to say is that's normal, but I have a couple of questions regarding that. And does the spine still have that lordotic curve in it, but it's just minimized, or are they flexing the spine, i.e. they literally have a rounded spine? So that's the bit that's unclear, because they may be holding the position, but as they go down into it, the spine just flattens out a bit. Now, the thing we need to understand with this one is, just because it's in the study doesn't mean it's right. So just because people are coming out of neutral doesn't mean it's normal, if that makes sense. Because it could be just limited range of movement of the hip. And instead of just hammering home, lift more weight, lift it from the floor, have the studies where they've got this from, have they looked at the ability to flex the hip and maintain a neutral spine in the bottom position of a deadlift, for example, or in the bottom position for a squat? So is it just that the individuals that are taking part in it, they just have a lack of range of movement in the hips, so that when they go down, their spine flexes as a compensation? Or is it they have plenty of range of movement of the hip, and when they go down, the spine flattens out a bit and comes out of the definition of the neutral zone? Because I'm not 100% sure that's been clarified. Could it be motor control? Could it be they've got the range of movement, they just don't know how to use it, if that makes sense? So when they get down into the bottom position and the coach says maintain a neutral spine, they don't sort of maintain the position of the hips, lift the chest up and maintain that natural curvature of the spine all the way down. So it could be something like that. These are the types of things that I'm unsure of, because they're saying, and they say it a couple more times in the study, that we don't need to use neutral spine in the weight room. And that's fine, because one of the places that they sort of talk about it is the strongmen, where they do like the Atlas stones as an example, where they sort of lift it and roll it over the knee onto the thigh, and their body is wrapped around it. Which, again, there's caveats with that, because it's a particular exercise, it's done in a particular way. The weight is about as close to the body as you can get it, because they literally roll it around the knees and it sits on the thigh. So not as much stress is put on the spine as it could be. The people that are doing it have certain tolerances and capacity for doing it. So again, we have to take that into consideration, which is what we've talked about before. So we have, again, it's not just as simple as, although it's consistently included, so although we are told to say maintain a neutral spine, in the weight room, as they say, evidence suggests that the spine's flexing, even though we're saying maintain it. But why is the spine flexing? Because is it flexing because they can't maintain it? Is it flexing because the spine or the neutral spine can't be maintained in that position? Or is it because the individual doing it doesn't have the range of motion of the hip, or they don't have the motor control to hold the position? So we have to, again, have the understanding of the person that stood in front of us and not just blindly follow what the science is saying. Because I know, certainly in my experience, personal experience that is, that if I put, one of the things I'll say is, for a tactile experience of a neutral spine, you put the back of your hand on your lower back. So you put your little finger at the top of your pelvis, you put your thumb sort of at the bottom of the thoracic spine. So when you stood up, you can feel the position it's in. And then what I say, when you hip hinge forward, does that position change? If it does, then you're moving out of neutral. If it stays the same, and then what you can do, if it stays the same, you're staying in neutral. And what you can then do is you can then understand how deep you can go into the hip hinge. So it's very much having that understanding that, okay, we're told we are meant to maintain a neutral spine, but is that actually happening? Is that the natural and done thing for the spine to come out of neutral, or is it just because they don't have the range of movement of the hip and they don't have the motor control to get into that position? That's what we have to come to understanding when we read or hear something like that. Part 4 is more about sort of like an injury mechanism or a pain trigger that certain people could experience. So the flexing of the spine, the loading of the spine is a better way of talking about it, and that being an injury mechanism and how robust is the spine against load. So it is therefore challenging to appreciate how a weightlifter performing approximately 20 to 25,000 repetitions of a multi-joint lifting exercise each year does not incur a lumbar disc herniation, vertebral body fracture, end plate fracture, or damage to the neural arch. That does happen because there is an example of that in a book back there called The Gift of Injury, which is written by, in part, Brian McCarroll, who's a powerlifter, world record holding powerlifter. Go and look him up, go and read his story, go and learn about what he's teaching people, because it's useful information. So this quote goes back to capacity, tolerance, conditioning of the individual, because there is no reason why they can't do this. It just depends on a few things. There's no reason why anyone can't do this. It just depends. Their tolerance for reps, so their tolerance to be able to do it multiple times, versus how many they do it. So their tolerance is obviously they're able to tolerate 20 to 25,000 repetitions. If there is zero pain involved, they're able to tolerate 20 to 25,000. Now, why are they able to tolerate 20 to 25,000 reps of multi-joint lifting exercises? Well, it could be because they recover adequately and properly. Not only do they recover between workouts properly, they recover between sets properly, and even potentially between reps properly. So they don't rush through the reps. They then rest properly in the sets, which then sort of leads on to the next two, which is they've got good session structure. So they've got adequate rest, recovery. They've got adequate warm-up. They've got adequate tissue conditioning, i.e. creating the range of movement needed to be able to do it. So they create the range of movement, they activate the muscles, they warm up the muscles, so they don't just jump in at the deep end and lift 20 to 25,000. Because if we go back to our occupational person, they've just had their boss tell them, I need you to move those 50 boxes from there to there in 30 minutes, go. There's no warm-up. There's no potential for rest. There's no sort of range of movement sort of prep. There's nothing there, but the weight room can have that. Now, with that said, there are plenty of people in the weight room that are damaging their spines, because I come across them, I speak to them, I read their comments, so on and so forth. And then finally, the program as a whole, it will depend on. So not only the individual session structure, but over the month, over the 6 months, over the year, there is going to be a program structure as well. So they won't be doing the same weight all year round. They won't be going through a linear fashion over 12 months of gradually increasing the weight. There's going to be dips, there's going to be increases, there's going to be more dips, and that's built into the program. So they'll be doing different sessions. They'll be doing lighter sessions, they'll be doing heavier sessions throughout the week and throughout the months and throughout the year. So again, we have to take that into consideration when we're talking about why weightlifters can do that. That doesn't mean that a person who starts going to the gym, that occupational person that we talked about, let's just say they damage their back, or they think, I'm going to damage my back, I need to go to the gym, they wouldn't start doing 20 to 25,000 reps of multi-joint lifting exercises throughout a year. It would need to be a gradual build-up to build the tolerance, to build the capacity, to be able to tolerate the load, so that when they have to move those 50 boxes again from where they've just moved them to another place, they'll be able to do it much more easily. So again, it's therefore challenging to appreciate how a weightlifter performing approximately 20 to 25,000 repetitions of multi-joint exercises each year does not incur. It's like, why should they? Just because it's that many reps doesn't mean they're going to injure their spine. It's not the total number of something that will damage it. It's how it's done. The recovery, the warm-up, the program structure, the session structure, how it builds up through the first few months of the year and then it drops off to add a little bit more recovery, how they change each workout day by day, how they use reps and sets to manipulate recovery so they don't always go heavy. They don't always do low rep, heavy weight. Sometimes they'll do higher rep, lighter weight. So it's not as easy as being able to just say that and use that as a means of justifying why someone can do something and someone else can't do it or should be able to do it or whatever. So yes, it's not as simple as just saying, well, if I can do it, then why can't you do it? You have to take the individual into consideration. In this final part, we're going to talk a little bit of what I think is a contradiction. Because throughout the paper, and again, this may be just my bias, this may be just how I'm reading it and interpreting it, but it seems like through the study there is a sort of a bias against using the neutral posture, because people, even when they lift, they come out of it, so therefore it doesn't matter. Although in part 2, when we talked about it, they did come to say that when you come out of neutral spine, you put more stress on the passive structures, and that can lead to tissue damage. Now, what they say at the end of the study, which is allowing some lumbar flexion to occur during lifting exercises, may therefore reduce stress on the passive structures at the hip and provide the athlete with a movement strategy that preserves the health of the hip joint. So what I think they're describing, now I need to sort of put that as a caveat to it, is this is how I'm interpreting it, is that when people flex their spine and they don't need to flex their hip as much, they are reducing the stress on the passive structures of the hip. But what we've already talked about is that if you come out of neutral, you put more pressure on the passive structures of the spine. So what we're dealing with now is checks and balances. So they're saying that if we come out of neutral, we'll put more pressure on the spine, but we'll save the hip. Whereas I'm saying, if we maintain neutral, we'll minimise pressure on the spine, but we'll put a bit more pressure on the hip. Now, for me personally, I would be more inclined to put more pressure on the hip, for the very simple reason that that is what the hip is designed for. Because way back, I guess it would be the 1500s, when Da Vinci was dissecting the body. I have his book back there. So it's basically a book. So if you've ever seen The Mechanics of Man by Leonardo da Vinci, he drew out human anatomy. He dissected bodies and he drew everything. And he's got notes, and these notes have been translated. And in that book, he says something along the lines of the greatest and most powerful muscle in the body is the buttocks, as when man is lifting. So he knew back then that those muscles were for lifting. We know now with science that we need to lift using the hips. They are strong, powerful muscles. The hip joint is a freely movable synovial joint. It is able to go through large ranges of movement. The muscles around it are strong and powerful. So we've got a joint that can go through large ranges of movement, and we've got muscles around it that can tolerate load, heavy load. Whereas when we look at the spine, it's different. It's a cartilaginous joint, or there are cartilaginous joints within the spine that will dictate its limited movement. So it's limited in movement. Its muscles aren't as strong and powerful as the glutes. So to me, it would be more advantageous to maintain the posture of the spine and focus on getting more force through the hip, for the very simple reason it can deal with it. Now again, as I've described all the way through this, that will depend on the individual's capacity to do it, because the hip is exactly the same as the spine, in that it needs to build tolerance, build capacity, so you're able to do the lifting. But what it sounds like is it's one rule for the hip and another rule for the spine. It's like you can bend your spine, but don't flex your hip. That's the kind of thing that, or they're not saying you shouldn't flex your hip, they're saying you have the potential. So if you flex your spine a bit, you will save your hip a bit. So again, I would be more inclined to do it the other way around. Maintain the posture of the spine as best you can. If you need to elevate a weight from the floor, then by all means do it. But focus on using the hips and getting the load through them and building them, because they are able to do it better. So with regards to the hip and the spine, or the maintaining of neutral spine, I should say, again, there's still nothing. Apparently I was going to be converted from this study, because he was very sure that I should read it. There were 126 references, so it must be a good study. But again, as I read it, there's still nothing in there that's terribly convincing that is changing my mind about how we use a neutral spine, how we lift, and things like that. It's not that there's not good information in them. There's good information in there. It just seems to be slanted in a certain direction when they talk about as we've described it, when they talk about maintaining a neutral spine. Well, we'd rather not flex the hip quite as much. I'd rather you bend the spine a bit than flex the hip as much, which again doesn't really sit with the consistency that seems to go through how to lift properly. So again, I could sort of go round in circles with this information, but I think it's wise to end there. So if you found this useful, please do hit the like button. If you've got something to say about anything that's been said in this podcast, if you agree, if you disagree, stick it in the comment section below. If you've learnt something new, hit the thanks button. And if you want to watch more like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon and you'll be notified. Many thanks for watching. Speak to you soon.